Who here has had strained relationships with family, friends, colleagues in the past 10 years? Maybe I should ask who hasn't. So you're in the right place. This panel, Cult of Personality, Psychology of Political Obedience, is for you. We have experts in their fields who've been working on this anywhere from 50 years to 7, Rich, maybe you're the most. You're the baby. So I'd like to introduce them. Will Sommer, the moderator, you may have known from The Bulwark, senior reporter at The Bulwark, where he writes false flag newsletter on right-wing media, political radicalization, and conspiracy theories across the MAGAverse. Will is the author of Trust the Plan, QAnon, and the Conspiracy That Unhinged America. Dr. Laura Field is a scholar whose research examines political behavior, democratic norms, and the psychological foundations of civic engagement. Dr. Field is the author of Furious Minds, The Making of the New MAGA Right. She was a recent guest on the Mona Sharon show. Mona was just here. Dr. Stephen Hassan has spent the past 50 years of his life as a mental health professional, forensic expert, helping people leave destructive cults since 1976, when his family deprogrammed him from the Moon cult, ex-Moonie. It's an incredible story that he shared earlier this week on Trevor Noah's podcast, What Now? He is the author of numerous books, including Combating Cult Mind Control, Freedom of Mind, and The Cult of Trump. Rich Logis, in his I Love MAGA hat, has dedicated his life to undoing the political damage he caused during his 7 years as a devoted MAGA activist, pundit, and podcaster. He speaks around the country and has been featured on major media outlets in the US and abroad. His autobiography, One Betrayal Too Many, Why I Left MAGA, was released just a couple days ago, right? And Dr. Maria Stefan is a scholar and practitioner whose 25-year body of work focuses on authoritarianism and nonviolent movements, civic resistance, and democratic resilience. She is currently Horizons Project co-lead, and she co-authored 5 books, including the multiple award-winning Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. And Dr. Stefan was recently a guest on Stephen Colbert. I guess Brendan Carr was not in the room. So I hope you find this panel really helpful. They will provide calls to action and guide you in your personal relationships with people who have been led astray. Thank you.
All right, thanks y'all. Thank y'all for coming out today. I'm Will Sommer with The Bulwark again, and I think this is it's so great to be here. I see we have a Greenland Defense Front shirt in the front row. There's like good vibes around here, right? As people concerned about American democracy. All right, and I think we have a loaded panel today. As you can hear, I think a lot of great stories, a lot of people who are passionate about democracy, opposing authoritarianism, and frankly, I mean, this stuff gets pretty weird, right? So I think there's some curiosity there, and we'll have some interesting stories. First, I'd like to kick things off. I mean, this is a panel about cults of personality. What role does sort of personal devotion play in authoritarianism, particularly obviously in the case of our current administration? And then what's the good news? How do we get out of it? And so first I'd like to kick things off with Dr. Laura K. Field here, who, by the way, whose book was like maybe the most important book last year on Trumpism in the face of the new right. Laura, could you talk about Trumpism as a cult of personality or personal devotion, in particular when it comes to the new right? And if you could define that, because I think it's not just sort of a Trumpian thing. There's sort of this particular wrinkle of what we're describing here and this kind of particular malevolent force.
Thank you. Yes, I'm so honored and delighted to be here with all of you. So my book is focused on this one slice of MAGA, which is the intellectual elite, and what I call the MAGA new right. And so it's a little different, like you said, it's a wrinkle in the mechanism here, because I think it's fair to say Trump is not exactly an intellectual. He's rather anti-intellectual and instinctive, but he's pretty clearly, I think it'd be a mistake to underestimate his instincts. And the people I've written about, the book kind of chronicles the emergence of this MAGA New Right movement between 2016 and 2024, and really the consolidation of power within the GOP. So if we're talking about a cult, it's the cult of the interns here in Washington, right? And the wonks and well, wonks is maybe an overstatement, right? But the people who are working within the administration and who are staffing the Capitol. So it's kind of a narrow slice, but I think it can help us to understand the difference between the first administration and the Trump-Vance administration, and the radicalization that we're seeing. And so, I mean, you can do an analytic description of what they stand for, and I can trot that out. But it's, you know, basically replacing the old liberal international order with nativist populism. The ideas are not especially surprising, but there are sort of threads that reach back to the old right and to paleoconservatism and Buchanan. And what the intellectuals I write about saw was that Trump really had these instincts that represented these festering parts of American conservatism that had been festering for a long, long time. But I think maybe where I differ, or my value added here is, I write a lot about the seductive quality of a lot of these ideas, and it's not so much the cult of personality behind Trump with these people. A lot of them, I think, have contempt for Trump. But it's the draw of radical ideas, anti-modern ideas, reactionary ideas, and just this sort of seductive character of a lot of the convictions, the strong convictions. And so that's what I try to demonstrate in the book and to draw out. I've been seduced by those ideas myself in my life as an academic. I'm a political theorist. I'm a pretty bookish person, but I love Friedrich Nietzsche, right? And I love the critics of liberalism. And I'm a good liberal now, but when I was younger, I was really drawn to just these sort of ruthless ideas in political philosophy. I'm not proud of that, right? But part of me has that. You know, I have that in me. And probably many of us do. And so I think one of the important things that I would say is it's important to kind of acknowledge that a lot of this isn't stupid. It's alluring, it's seductive. Fascism was really seductive to a lot of smart people, I'm sorry to say. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. So maybe that can get us started off.
Great. Thank you. So, you know, if we're talking about cult of personality, we got to talk to Stephen Hassan, who was in an actual cult. And, you know, we'll get into your personal history in a second, but if you could talk to us, when we talk about a cult of personality, what do we mean by that? You know, at least as far as you see it.
So I use Erich Fromm's, social psychologist's, malignant narcissism as an understanding of the stereotypical profile of cult leaders. And it's not just narcissism and lack of empathy, but also thinking they're above the law, pathological lying, sadistic, revengeful, etc. There's a whole list, and I did, in fact, chapter 3 of The Cult of Trump, comparing Donald Trump with Jim Jones, Sun Myung Moon, my former cult leader, and Hubbard of Scientology. My frame is different because I had a firsthand experience. I grew up 1.3 miles from Donald Trump, by the way, in Flushing, Queens, so I knew about Donald Trump as an unsavory character my whole life. But my frame is psychological warfare, going back to the Cold War, and how there's been psychological warfare leveled by our government against other governments against our government. So my framing is 50 years, and I'll just say I was in the room with Sun Myung Moon in 1974 when he said, we're going to infiltrate the US government. God hates democracy. He wants a theocracy. And when we take power in America, we'll amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense for people to violate our rules. And I was so brainwashed, I would have died on command or killed on command. Quick to answer your question, I got deprogrammed. I learned about Chinese communist brainwashing. That's what turned on the lights, because when I was in the cult, I didn't feel I was brainwashed. but I thought the commies did brainwashing. So I was open to learning about another enemy of the United States, and it was that when I applied it to my experience in the Moonies did all of those. And that began my exit to the group. And here I am 50 years later, educating people about how to discern ethical influence and unethical influence, and helping people to know how to talk to people in cults to help them get out, which I think we'll have time to get into later.
Great, thank you. Now, Rich, you were obviously a Trump devotee. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, you started as an independent, right? And then Trump just grabbed you in such a way. What was it about Trump's personality or his sort of visceral appeal that pulled you in?
So let me just preface by saying that I would like to apologize for my past MAGA activism. If I had met any of you here who are not in MAGA, I would have deemed you an existential threat to my life and my livelihood and my family and my country, and I'm sorry, because you would not have deserved to have been spoken that way. And if anyone's watching this who's in MAGA, I would like to say to them that today is a stellar day to leave MAGA. So I was attracted to Donald Trump's campaign as a political independent, as someone who felt very politically lonely. I believe that the two parties were the same. I felt that American democracy had failed most Americans and was only in existence for the wealthy and the powerful. And even though Donald Trump ran as a Republican, I gravitated to the campaign because of his outsider status. No government, no military, no political experience at all. And I thought that what we needed at the time was to obliterate the established political order and build it anew. And I came to realize that after leaving MAGA, that it's much easier to tear something down than it is to build it up. And I was not someone who was just a Trump supporter on the peripheral. I volunteered for the campaign. I helped write part of the call script. After the 2016 election, I got deeper and deeper into the MAGA world. I spent my own money to professionally podcast. That's money that could have gone to my own family, and instead it went to my MAGA activism. I wrote for lots of MAGA media, including places like Fox and The Federalist and American Greatness, which is a work that Dr. Field mentions in her book. But it was in early 2021, up until the summer, when my doubts commenced. And it was actually not Donald Trump who was the first accelerant of my leaving MAGA. It was my governor, Ron DeSantis, in Florida. And what he did was, at the time, is he platformed COVID anti-vaxxers at his press conference. And I was never an anti-vax person. It confused me, and I didn't understand why he was doing that. And after he did that, I did something that sounds very simple, but was profoundly life-altering and changing for me, which was I diversified my news and information sources. And after I did that, it led me on a 1 year, which I call a journey of my year of heaven and hell, to the point of May 24th, 2022, which was the day of the Uvalde, Texas school shooting. And it was on that day that I decided to leave MAGA, albeit quietly. It was in August of 2022 when I wrote and published a mea culpa. And I said in that story that I was sorry for supporting Trump, and that I wanted to apologize to anyone I may have hurt with my words, deeds, and rhetoric. And when that was published, I actually never thought that anybody would care. But it turned out that people did care. And I'm thankful to all of you and all the people I have met who have told me that our leadership at Leaving MAGA and other people who have left, that it provides sources of inspiration. And I think, Will, that what Donald Trump did is he took a brand of right-wing politics, which was something I was very ignorant about when I was in MAGA and beforehand, and he branded it Make America Great Again. And as the person who branded that form of politics, he became a leader of the MAGA community, because that's what I call MAGA. It is a place where people have found purpose and a sense of belonging and a sense of gathering, and they look at Donald Trump as the titular leader of that community. And that's why when Donald Trump is off the political scene, the good news is I believe that MAGA will start to unravel. The bad news is that we need to catch people before they get subsumed into whatever else comes next after MAGA and after Trump. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you all for caring about my story and all the other stories of our leaders who left.
Thank you. So Maria, I think you have a fascinating personal story. You were someone who was opposing authoritarianism in other countries like Venezuela and the Balkans. And then you realized, I think, that America needed those same kind of techniques and support. When did you have that realization? And how can people get involved? How can they normalize opposing, an authoritarian figure like Donald Trump?
Sure, thanks, Will. And Rich, thank you for your story. And just like first, I want to express appreciation for Principles First. I'm looking out to this ballroom, and there are just so many incredibly talented, dedicated people. Last year was my first Principles First summit, and you all may recall there was a bomb threat. And do you remember when we all came back together after that bomb threat? The level of shared commitment, of purpose, of dedication. I felt so proud to be part of this community. So just thank you. And every year it gets bigger and bigger. So Heath, Brittany, thank you for all you've done with this community. So I've spent 25 years working with and writing about movements all around the world who have challenged various forms of authoritarianism. And these have been left-wing dictatorships. These have been right-wing authoritarian regimes. I come from Polish ancestry, so I'm deeply proud of the story of the Polish Solidarity movement that through trade unions, the Catholic Church, students used all these creative, powerful tactics to dismantle a communist dictatorship. And I've been deeply inspired in our own history thinking about Jim Crow in the South, which was a racial authoritarian system. And some of my mentors growing up, taught me the power of organizing, of training, of the discipline that led to the Montgomery bus boycotts, the lunch counter sit-ins, the Selma marches. So the deep discipline and persistence that helped challenge authoritarianism. And I also know, around the world, this allure of authoritarianism, like what I've experienced, and I saw this starting to play out in the US. Why do people obey at the end of the day? Why is there obedience? They obey for many reasons. They obey out of habit. They've always done it. They obey out of psychological identification with the ruler. They obey out of fear of punishment, fear of sanction, fear of being ostracized. They obey out of self-interest because they're gaining something from the relationship. They obey out of a belief that we don't have the power to change anything. And I think, because political power depends on all of these forms of obedience, it's really fragile. Because at the end of the day, authoritarian regimes ultimately depend on the consent and obedience of ordinary people. And when we withdraw that consent and obedience, they are like emperors with no clothes. That's where our power comes from. And I think as I was seeing, certainly, knowing the history of authoritarianism in this country, but certainly with the first Trump administration, the level of dehumanization of the other, the attacks on the media as the enemies of the people, the attacks on independent institutions, just the self-aggrandizement, all the way up to, helping to lead an insurrection in an attempted coup. So all the signs, all the elements of the authoritarian playbook were very clear during the first Trump administration. And now, in the 2.0 version with less guardrails in place, it's just been even more clear that we're dealing with a regime bent on retribution, a regime that's using the power of the state to punish people, to punish opposition, to terrorize our communities with with federal agents who are going in, abducting people in masks. And so it became so visceral and so clear. But then, like, what gives me hope is that in this country and around the world, people have confronted authoritarian regimes. They have used weapons of will. They have used protest, vigils, marches, strikes, boycotts, walkouts, lots of different actions. They have built the alternatives, and they have prevailed. And I have deep confidence that given the feistiness of the American people, the entrepreneurialism, the civic spirit, that we can do it here.
Thank you. So Stephen, obviously you have a very interesting personal story, and I would love to hear what it was personally that drew you into an authoritarian personality cult type movement. And if you could offer some specific insights, I was struck by Rich saying that he was sort of, he kind of fell out with MAGA over things like you're supposed to accept that the COVID vaccine is bad for you, or January 6th was just sort of a walk around the Capitol. It seems like in these personality movements, there's often, the followers are expected to believe in increasingly outlandish things, almost as a sign of loyalty. Maybe you could touch on that as well.
Sure. So the most important principle in social psychology is called the fundamental attribution error. And why it's so fundamental is when people try to understand why Steve joined the Moonies, they over-attribute something wrong with Steve and under-attribute all of the deception, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, and psychological warfare techniques that were used on Steve. In my story, I was situationally vulnerable because my girlfriend dumped me abruptly. I was sitting in the cafeteria at Queens College, and 3 Mooney women smiled and love-bombed me. "Oh, Steve, you're so smart, and we want to know all about you." And I said, "Are you students?" "Yes. Can we sit at your table?" I was never a joiner. I was writing poetry. I was reading 2 to 3 books a week. I had skipped 8th grade. I was not a joiner, but my mind got hacked. And how did it work? I wrote chapter 2 of Combating Cult Mind Control to detail all of the specifics. But what I've learned in 50 years is, yes, there are situational vulnerabilities that we all as human beings are susceptible to, but let's look at the techniques of predators and traffickers and predatory organizations. And in specific, I told you, I was in the room 52 years ago hearing about the takedown of the US. Russia wants to take down the US. Putin was never happy that the Soviet Union collapsed, and there's been a plan to take away our checks and balances and to put think tanks in place and to dismantle things. So what I want to emphasize is, and many of you raised your hands, you know someone in your family and friends, a lot of people were just plain Republicans. Maybe they were following their congressman or senator. Maybe they were watching Fox News. Maybe they were in a church group that mirrors authoritarian cults, where the leader said, "I am a prophet," or "I am an apostle, and God told me." Donald Trump won the 2020 election. And if you have any doubts about what God told me, you have a demon, and I can help exorcise the demon. We're talking about 20, 30 million Americans who were raised in these or recruited into these mega churches. So again, my frame is much more psychological warfare. But the good news is brainwashing does not erase your real self or your values. It's best understood as a dissociative disorder. So the real Steve was still there. I just had a Mooney Steve that like a computer gets hacked and takes over your operating system. I had a Mooney Steve that was inculcated to shut down the real me. But after a near-fatal van crash, 2 weeks in the hospital away from the cult, I had the opportunity to meet with ex-members because my father cried and said, how would you feel if it was your son who met a controversial group? Please listen with an open mind. And if you want to go back, I'll drive you myself. But at least your mother and I will be able to sleep at night knowing we did the responsible thing. And I was a true believer, and I wanted to prove I wasn't in a cult and brainwashed. So I agreed. And within 5 days, my lights turned on again. It's like, we're doing Chinese communist brainwashing on Steve. This is not what God wants. And here I am 50 years later.
Right, thank you so much. So Laura, I want to just kind of circle back. Obviously, your expertise is on the new right. I mean, these are the people we're talking about in not just the administration now, but I think in particular in 2028 and going forward if J.D. Vance is the nominee. And I guess from my point of view, correct me if I'm wrong, but it strikes me that what's unique about the new right is their belief in using the power of the state to really crush their foes. Whether it's culturally, things like someone mentioned Stephen Colbert, it just sort of all across the spectrum, using the government in a way that they feel previous Republicans, perhaps a lot of the Principles First crowd, were too focused on things like the Bill of Rights or the Constitution or not being hypocrites. So who are the people who are in this movement? Who are like the faces we would recognize? And what can we, I hate to say look forward to, what can we expect if they really are ascendant in a Vance administration?
So, I mean, J.D. Vance is their baby, right, and their darling. So he's really the main face of it, and he's their big, glorious success story. The other people, there's a whole sort of map in my book about the different factions. Some names that might be familiar are Patrick Deneen at the University of Notre Dame or Adrian Vermeule at Harvard, who are part of the post-liberal faction, the kind of creme de la creme of the new right, and tend to be, they're Catholic, very conservative Catholics. There are others like Yoram Hazony, who runs the National Conservatism Conference that people have probably heard of, and that's the gathering place for a lot of these people. And then there are the Claremonters. Probably everybody's read the articles about the Claremonters. Michael Anton, who just wrote the new security report, is associated with them. And of course, John Eastman, who wrote the coup memos. So you have that group. And then you've also got sort of I call it the hard right underbelly, but these very hardcore fascist types. Some are Catholic, some are Nietzschean pagans. You may have heard of Bronze Age pervert. These are raw egg nationalist. Curtis Yarvin, right? There have been a lot of profiles of him. And so those are some of the names, and they all have different ideas about what's ideal, but they have kind of pragmatically come around to the idea that what you want to do is harness the administrative state, you destroy what you can, and then you take what's left over to impose a new order, right? And it's very radical. A lot of it's very anti-modern, and I think that they all basically think that the old conservatives are friends in the room, right? They failed to conserve anything, and so what they've taken it upon themselves to take over the regime. That's the kind of language they use. And Trump is an opportunity, a vehicle for that, right? To take over the regime and to impose this sort of new, they probably wouldn't themselves use the word fascist, though some of them are happy to, an authoritarian, imposing morality, right, on the order. And what they offer, I think, especially to young people, is this sense of moral order and hierarchy and answers to life, right? We live in a liberal democracy. We don't, part of that is not imposing one set of values, one way of life on any person. And I think a lot of young people, I mean, a lot of us, that's a real challenge, right? So where do we get our values from? Where do we get our guidance from? How ought we to live? Obviously, these are big questions for everyone. And the new right comes along and they say, we have answers. And Donald Trump is going to be our vehicle to reorganize society around some of those. Because the old liberal order was so all-imposing and threatening, too. That's another part of it. There's a very deep conspiratorial dimension to it. So looking forward to the future, I think that one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is that I think the people I write about are far more radical than most American voters. This is not what people voted for with Donald Trump. And I mean, maybe many of them did, of course, right? Of course, many did. But From a different perspective, I think that they were not, they had a lot of other reasons for voting for Trump, right? Nobody really believed the Project 2025 stuff. I think American citizens weren't really ready to hear about some of the radical projects that Trump had in mind and weren't ready to believe that he would actually proceed with that. And so I don't think they like this. I think that there's not nearly as much radicalization in the average American voter. So I think there's something very strong about the current administration and also something very weak, which brings us to J.D. Vance. I think he's in a very difficult position. I think the GOP is, I hate to say it, but forever changed, right? I think that the people who are being cultivated in the GOP right now, there is a lot of this stuff. It's pretty nasty. It's pretty scary. But I don't think that it matches up or aligns necessarily with what American voters want. And J.D. Vance is in a very difficult position because of all the infighting, because of the Fuentes stuff, because of Epstein, and because he can show zero leadership, right?
No, I think that's real. When someone, Gavin Newsom's just a lot hotter than him as one of these famous these looks maxers. I don't know. Anyways, it's kind of the hot new thing.
I think Rubio might be more frightening.
I think that's a great point. I bet you guys didn't expect to hear about Bronze Age pervert and raw egg nationalist today. So I think let's get 2 questions over here, and then we'll go into audience questions, and we'll close with a lightning round about what makes you optimistic. So, Rich, you mentioned you were encouraging other Trump supporters to leave the MAGA movement. I guess looking at the sort of national atmosphere, do you think more people are leaving Trumpism, and what's driving that?
So I am happy to report that as an organization, leaving MAGA has never been busier. Thank you. We are now featuring leaders and testimonials of people who were 2024 MAGA supporters who left sometime last year. We're in touch with people who identify right now as MAGA and are having doubts and their own confusion and struggling a little bit with what's going on around the country. And I do think there is an increasing number of people who are in the MAGA community right now who see that something is amiss nationally. They see that their communities are being torn asunder by actions from ICE. They're seeing their neighbors, the people they see when they frequent businesses, they're seeing them apprehended without due process. I think that the cracks are starting to show right now in MAGA, and I think as those fissures and those chasms widen, this is a great opportunity for all of us who have friends and family in MAGA. Because I'm asked all the time, Rich, what do I do to get through to my mom, my dad, my kids, my best friend? And my answer is that there's a couple of things that you can do. First is to be superhumanly patient with them. Second is to let them know that if they ever themselves have doubts and are questioning their support for MAGA, that you can be there for them as a friendly ear. Because if they feel that they can turn to someone, if they're feeling that MAGA is not comporting with their values and they have a friendly ear to turn to without judgment, without being ostracized, without being censured, then you can avail yourself to those individuals who are in MAGA and let them know that they can turn to you. And of course, if they turn to you, what we would ask at Leaving MAGA is introduce them to us so we can meet them and we can give witness to their stories and their testimonies. So I'm, not to get ahead of the lightning round, Will, but I am optimistic right now that I do think that there is a shift happening in the country, and I think as that shift happens, we're seeing more and more Americans who have traditionally been apolitical who are starting to pay attention more to politics. And those who have been politically indifferent, they're paying attention because they see the failed promises of the Trump administration, especially when it comes to affordability. So the shift is happening. I wish that it were happening more rapidly, but I am hopeful that I think that come in the midterms, even though I am not a Democrat and I do not belong to any party, I'm loath to prognosticate, but I think that the midterms are going to result in an electoral repudiation and revolt against MAGA.
Thank you. So Maria, just quickly, For the average person who just feels despair looking at what's going on in the country, in the situation in Minneapolis or elsewhere, what is one concrete thing people can do to fight authoritarianism, to build community, to support democratic institutions?
Yeah, I mean, what is wonderful is that there are so many ways to get involved in this moment, and we have so much power and agency. And, you know, and a key thing is don't go at it alone. Join a group. Join your local PTA, join your local bar association, chamber of commerce, congregation, getting involved, meeting people here. So who is here from your state? Find 5 people. What can you do together? And the thing is, too, that authoritarian regimes have no power without the support of key institutions. So without the support of businesses and kind of business elites, without the support of faith organizations, without the support of police, military, media outlets, so people within those pillars have tremendous power. If they shift, that's what brings about change. And so if you are a lawyer in this group, are there any lawyers here? If you're a lawyer, there are lots of things you can do. So there's a new initiative, the Democracy Rising Collaborative has just come out with a toolkit for what lawyers can do called theruleoflawyers.org, theruleoflawyers.org. If you're a small business owner in this room, there are groups that are organizing businesses in this moment to stand up for the rule of law and for sensible business practices. There's Integrity Matters in this room who's organizing small businesses. There's the Business Response to Authoritarian Threats that's bringing different corporate actors together. If you're a faith organization, I take so much inspiration from groups like the Mormon Women for Ethical Government, who are bringing people together across difference, showing off, offering pastoral presence, accompanying communities. If you are a veteran, there are organizations like the Unite for Veterans Coalition that are offering people's homes, places where they can come and get engaged. Just doing 1 or 2 things well, getting involved with community, getting involved is something we can all do, and that's what brings the change.
Thank you. All right. Okay, I think we have time for 1, and maybe if we're quick, 2, maybe, who knows? Let's try to get as many as we can from the audience. Okay, great. Will you be picking people? Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the talk. It's been very interesting. My name is Jennifer Shields. I live in Maryland. I am one of those people with 2 loved ones, both my parents. And I think what I've analyzed over the time with them is the effect of Fox News and that ecosystem. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. So how do we combat that?
That's a great question.
Especially with CBS News and potentially CNN becoming part of that ecosystem as well.
Sure.
So let me just, because we're running out of time, say that what doesn't work is to attack the leader, the doctrine, or the policy of any cult. Logic and facts will activate the cult identity to defend and think you're persecuting them. What works is warm, respectful, curious, active listening. And the secret power is asking a good question and being quiet while the person thinks about it. And as I mentioned before, learn about Chinese communist principles of Robert J. Lifton, for example, and his 8 criteria. That's what helped me get out. I have a model called the BITE model of authoritarian control, which works for pimps and traffickers. Talking to people in MAGA about Chinese communism and pimps and traffickers and how they brainwash people, they'll talk with you about that. You can share a documentary about Scientology or some other cult. You want them to think, okay, what is brainwashing? How can we discern? And they will help themselves get out. Because as Rich said, there's dissonance happening inside. And we want to have a big exit ramp and welcome our family and friends back. We want to, if we blocked them or muted them, we want to say, I miss you, I want you back in my life. Let's not talk politics, but let's be in each other's life, because they will leave. And I do agree, Rich, lots of people are leaving.
Thank you. Can we get 1 more question from the audience? I think we can fit, just in the interest of, and thank you all for raising your hands. I wish we could take a lot more.
Thank you. and thank you to the panel. I'm from one of those rural states that Connor Lamb talked about. Although I'm sure my accent gives away that I do live in New Jersey. So I'm from Tennessee. I've lived in Seattle, which along the coast is just great. Go 25 miles across the Cascades, you may as well be in Christy Nome's front yard. Those people are not, I agree with you, Steve, they can't be reasoned with. But the other part is, who is the audience? How do we reach them, Dr. Fields? They don't want to hear it. They think we're the elitists on the coast. My grandson at Christmas, who goes to an $80,000 a year Northeastern University, at the table, said, "Grandma, do you know that 90% of all the officials in the U.S. government are paid for by Israel?" And I said, "Okay, son, where is your evidence?" He said, "Well, 90% of the people my age agree with that, believe that." So I'm thinking there's a problem with basic epistemology, scientific proof. How do we deal with fact? And how do we move through a post-factual society?
I think that's a great point. Just briefly, Rich, perhaps you could take that. Can you talk just very briefly about the power of the MAGA media ecosystem? It strikes me as a real bubble.
Well, when I was in MAGA, I will say that any information that even remotely refuted the pervasively held mythologies and beliefs, it was shunned. It was kept out. And the lady who mentioned Fox News over there, something that I have tried before, sometimes it's succeeded, sometimes not, is an information bartering. You read an article or a podcast episode that your MAGA close one or friend or family watches or listens to. If they read or listen to something, you provide them. And if you're able to do that, and if the other person is not willing, that's not on you. But if they're willing to do it, now you've introduced them to alternative sources of information. That's how you combat the disinformation, because the right-wing media, that's its mantra. The mana of the right wing is disinformation.
Great. Well, in the interest of time, I think, we've had a pretty optimistic panel. I think we've got a lot of things already to be optimistic about. So I do want to thank everyone so much for joining us, and our panelists as well. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.